Screeching means we're going to start. Welcome, everybody. Today is Wednesday, November 22nd. Oh, wait. That's wrong. Tuesday, November 21st. Sorry about that. I don't know where that newspaper came from. And I'm John Dunbar. I am the general editor of the Royal Asiatic Society Korea, and I'm going to be the MC tonight. Thank you for joining us. We welcome friends and members who are attending in person here in Seoul and joining us on Zoom. I'm looking into the camera. I express RAS's sincere gratitude to the Asia Development Foundation for their continued financial support. We also thank COAT for partnering with us to provide a venue for our lectures. We usually encourage you to patronize Joseon Salon at the end of the alley here, but it's a private event tonight. Have a peek in. It looks quite wild, but we're not invited. So after this lecture, we're going to go to a broccoli bar or something, probably. So I'll let you know about that later. Your patronage helps COAT continue their work and also to support our work. And yeah. So you're cordially reminded that lecture content does not necessarily reflect the opinions or positions of RAS Korea. So yes, always remember that. Tonight we are joined by Matt Watson, Rob Watson, James Watson. I don't know, he's got a lot of first names.
Clear that up in a second.
He completed an MA in East Asian Studies with the GSIS program at Korea University, and has since been continuing his education in international studies while educating others at Sungkyul University in Anyang, south of Seoul. During his time studying at Korea University, he was examining how alcohol has become an increasingly important product when countries seek to promote themselves and their food abroad. He looked into the gastrodiplomacy of Korea as well as Japan, I believe, and probably other countries, but I'm assuming we're going to hear mostly about Korea. So I'd like to welcome Matt to take the microphone from me.
Thank you. Sorry, guys. Okay. All right. Hang on a sec, folks. We'll figure this out more or less sooner rather than later. Does that work? Nope. I don't think so. One more time.
The online mic. This is the.
Which one do you want me to do? Okay. Let's get this show on the road. All right, folks. Can everybody hear me okay, first and foremost? Does that make sense? Yeah, I think we're okay. Otherwise, yeah. Is it off? Okay. Anyways, I guess we'll stand over here just because of the cables and whatnot. Thanks, Dunbar, for the lovely sort of introduction there. As he mentioned, I finished my MA here during the sort of COVID campaign, so the experience was relatively interesting. Did make it kind of difficult to get to places like Japan and Korea in general due to research, but we managed to pull it off, and thankfully there was some degree of flexibility here to work with. The reason why I'm introducing Japan is
You do use a mic.
Okay. So part of the reason that I included Japan here is just because this is sort of the kind of front runner model that I use to create this comparative study. So I'll try to sort of stay clear of that as much as possible, but I do want to sort of give a sense of what they're up to and how this can be sort of a useful example and how Korea can expand on its own sort of gastrodiplomacy campaigns. That makes sense. And so, yeah, that's the general sort of outline for today. When I'm referring to the idea of a liquid lining, I'm borrowing from the phrase a silver lining. And so my point here is that a lot of the time you've probably heard about the sort of global handshake campaign and other things of that nature here in Korea. And what this sort of implies is that alcohol is a pretty good product to go in bottles and be shipped around the world. And it also comes from a lot of agricultural products here in Korea. And so I think there's some added benefits that we can sort of get from using this particular form of product and highlighting these products alongside the Global Handshake campaign and other things of that nature. So that's sort of the general run of the story here. You have to pardon me, it's been a long day, but we'll get through it in the end. Oops. So there's just a few things here. I'll go through the introduction and sort of a general framework of what we'll be talking about today. Afterwards, I'll be looking at the sort of government diplomacy to global glasses. We're trying to sort of stay in a kind of culinary vein, and from every plate to every glass. Sorry, and finally we'll have some. Okay, let's give this a go. So, and just trying to keep things sort of in this kind of alcoholic sort of formula. We'll talk about some concluding remarks in the sort of aperitif. And obviously you guys will have a chance to engage more in quick Q&A. I tried to keep this sort of fairly succinct, but we'll see how that goes. So just to begin, we're sort of giving the idea of food for thought. A lot of the research that I had to cover sort of involved sort of this idea of looking at food in sort of a broader sense. I didn't really come to this sort of line of research in a sort of intentional way. Originally, I was going to talk about free trade, and then the Trump administration showed up, and here we all are. So that kind of not only gave me food for thought, but a pause to sort of consider what I was researching. And part of the reason I included the Omnivore's Dilemma, this is one of the sort of early books I read in my undergrad years ago that caught me thinking more about food as an industry and as a global supply chain and other sort of issues. And likewise, I sort of wondered what it was about free trade that I thought was appealing, right? What is it? How is living in Korea and being sort of impacted by sort of multiple fairly large trade agreements had an impact on me? And so that's where I started sort of digging around and looking into these sort of food research because quite frankly, I really like going to the convenience store and finding 16 different kinds of beer on the shelf, half of which I'd never tried before. Likewise, going to Costco and finding an equal number of selections of cheese, for example, on the shelf, some of which I've never tried before. That kind of gave me a sort of a direction to go with this study. And so I started with some basic books over here, for example, from Belasco, and this is about 20 years old. And there's some very interesting stories in there. I'm born and raised in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and there was a great chapter about donut shops in Canada. Now, obviously, that's not what I ended up talking about, but I really tried. I really did try to make that somehow stick or work or be part of it. But I realized that there are some very interesting stories going on related to food and how we interact with that. And that's how we sort of move into this idea of food identity and nationalism, which became kind of some of the foundational stuff that I was working with. And so I think there's an interesting story here, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But okay, I'm kind of trapped. Anyways, I hope to have sort of an interesting look at how some of these sort of, like the title suggests, everyday items ends up being sort of representative and important for how we determine, you know, things like national identity and how to sort of promote that abroad. So, moving along. When we talk about putting sort of nationalism on the menu, I want to highlight the idea that food links every day to matters of national sovereignty, international politics, and the economy and global culture rights. But I think something that would be familiar for everyone here is, as I mentioned before, this idea of a sort of promotion of Korean food products that kicks off in, I think, 2008, okay? But more recently, right, when we have this story over here from the BBC, right, the notion of something as fundamental to Korea as kimchi becomes kind of contentious, right? We have interactions between Japan and China over these issues, and it sort of evaporates for a while and then inevitably seems to come back every few years as something to be kind of upset about. And so this does sort of kind of highlight the sort of significance that food has in people's mindsets and how we sort of identify ourselves and where we come from. I revert back to the donut shops of Canada. Anyways, there we go. So in this case, the idea of dishing out sort of gastrodiplomacy appears in another British publication, The Economist, about 2002. I highly doubt that I actually read that original article, but it does point out, as it says here, food as an ambassador, Thailand's gastrodiplomacy. And this comes out about February 21, 2002. And it highlights this idea that the Thai government has been working on, where it's sort of the kitchen of the world, and then how they employed that going forwards to sort of not only train, fund, and develop Thai cuisine as something that's available and accessible outside of Thailand, but also to develop sort of advertising campaigns to promote that going forward. So this is where this kind of starts getting going. Oops. Sorry. And so a lot of this comes into this idea of public diplomacy, and I'll go through this in a little way with 3 courses, essentially. We'll try and sort of simplify the kind of theoretical background to it to give you guys a easier thing to play with as we move along. But some of the main tenets here that Banks highlights in 2020 about public diplomacy is that it does support sort of foreign policy priorities, provides economic benefits, strengthens mutual understanding, and projects values and enhances the image, and can potentially sort of manage crises abroad, right? So in this sense, that's sort of the main idea that comes out of the 1960s. And within that, we're going to look at a couple of key ideas. So when I was doing my research into this, I found that we needed to kind of maybe simplify this, but also focus on some of the key aspects that they were sort of covering under this umbrella of public diplomacy. Some of these things are relatively sort of fresher concepts in the academic world, but the idea of nation branding, cultural diplomacy, and culinary diplomacy, which I sort of summarized as awareness, appreciation, and access. Nation branding, sort of borrowing a lot from the private sector to create sort of awareness and understanding of your products and what is available and what is sort of fundamentally from your country. Cultural diplomacy is a little broader, goes into the idea of appreciation. I'll give you some examples a little bit and later on. And finally, the idea of sort of culinary diplomacy, which I think the last slide that talks about sort of the Thai program kind of leads into a fair bit, the idea of sort of training and promoting the ability to engage with these cuisines. And that leads to access, which is sort of a big part of this. And we'll see that sort of in restaurants and other affairs. So just a quick highlight here about, using sort of the private sector aspects of nation branding to kind of get us sort of into a more influential space in the world. And I think that that's just sort of maybe a little unnecessary at this point. But as you can see, especially when we come into a more globalized age in the 1990s, the ability to sort of project yourself outside of traditional Cold War parameters becomes much more important. One thing that always stuck into my mind when we think about these kind of nation branding activities is where the British have sort of gone. Once again, I remember from the 90s, a sort of cool Britannia kind of concept when we had Blair and Spice Girls and Oasis and all this sort of fun stuff kind of mixing together. There was sort of this kind of, once again, very sort of economist kind of title there. And more recently, you see this kind of rebranding effort that's gone on in England post-Brexit. The idea of global Britain and trying to get sort of back into the trade game as an independent actor. Okay? I'm not sure how effective global Britain is going to be going forward, but all the best. Likewise, cultural diplomacy being a bit more broader, we see this idea of exchanging ideas, values, traditions, and other aspects of cultural identity. And so this would probably be one of the more broader aspects of this, but you can kind of see how using food as sort of a form of tradition and culture would be a way of doing that. This always sort of stuck out to me here. This is sort of a China Daily article from years ago, but it did kind of remind me of the first time that I went to China in 2005. And I found this kind of very sort of emblematic of some of the sort of maybe not so intentional cultural diplomacy that goes on from the United States in regards to particularly hip hop music and other sort of things that come out of this kind of semi-formal cultural space. And the thing that really got me is that if you went to, sort of the center of Beijing or Shanghai, there was these massive dance clubs where you were getting a lot of top 40 stuff going on. And it seemed like a very interesting sort of example of that. And they sort of catch on to this with the China Daily, which obviously these days is not as friendly an actor in that respect. And one of the other things that kind of caught my eye when we think about the idea of cultural diplomacy is here in Seoul, when we have the St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Shindo. Okay. I think that's sort of a very good example of sharing traditions, not only if it comes to food, but also the idea of getting Gaelic football and other aspects involved. And I thought that would sort of kind of represent sort of a holistic effort. Likewise, on St. Patrick's Day, the Irish government dispatches government ministers and employees across the land, the planet, sorry, to interact with people through their embassies and sort of to kind of raise the flag and bring attention to Ireland, which, if we're being honest, is quite a relatively small country out there in the sort of international scene. So this gives you kind of a sense of where I'm going with this. Obviously, I'll be focused more on things that are related to cuisine and food, but just wanted to lay some groundwork there for everyone in the audience in case they're not exactly on the same page. When we get into culinary diplomacy, that becomes a little bit more specific, and this definition has been kind of sort of contended by a couple of people. I prefer to look at it more in this kind of official governmental sense, at least in regards to my research here. And I think one of the clearest examples of that has been this sort of kind of culinary core that the US government has been employing through the State Department. Like when we talk about Space Corps and all this sort of stuff, right? Like these, the uniforms became quite a sort of emblematic kind of the uniforms became kind of a sort of social media thing. And I thought that was kind of interesting because you do see participants in this program all have been issued uniforms by the US government that are, very much chef smocks, but very clearly sort of branded and representing sort of an official government capacity. Informally, when we talk about culinary diplomacy outside of the government context, you could look at Dave Chang, who came here through NBC, quite famous American chef, particularly with Momofuku, which really sort of plays into a sort of Korean fusion cuisine in the United States. That sort of, to me, represented kind of a more informal or non-governmental aspect of that. Yeah, anyways, some quick examples there for you. So, as you can see, I'm quite the artist, so bear with me here if I diagram. So, as I was saying at the beginning, public diplomacy sort of represented the kind of broader home to where this would all be housed. And so the main thing here was this idea of using national branding strategies, cultural diplomacy, culinary diplomacy, which would come under this kind of term of gastrodiplomacy that shows up not only in the Economist article, but is sort of explored academically about 10 years later. And like I said, I think that there's a real sort of liquid lining to this philosophy. that, alcohol can be kind of a very useful product to not only engage with other countries, but also to help sort of alleviate issues in rural areas that are, by and large getting depopulated in places like Japan and Korea. Yeah. Anyways, let's move on from my masterpiece here. So in this way, I'm kind of looking at the state as a brewmaster, a vintner, and a distiller. Okay. This idea that they're kind of there to facilitate a lot of these activities. And so we'll go into this a little bit more. But one of the first things that I'm looking at when I compare these two is part of this idea that there's a lot of institutions when we're talking about sort of who's cooking in public diplomacy. And so I will take just a little moment to kind of go through a few of these things. Got to a point where I thought it was necessary to have a bit of a acronym glossary for my study there. And so it's, prudent to figure out who's who in the alphabet soup of agencies and ministries that do get involved in this kind of story. A lot of where our story starts when it comes to the sort of promotion and development of national campaigns around alcohol products sort of begins here in Japan. And it's largely under the supervision of the agriculture and forestry and fisheries industry. And it subsequently gets slowly taken over by these sort of residual organizations that are lower in the sort of pecking order. And you can see that a similar strategy starts also at the ministry here in Korea that's sort of supervising agriculture products. So I think more importantly here in Korea, the idea of rural affairs is a big one. But we'll see how all these organizations kind of contribute in their own way to promoting a sort of, like I say, liquid lining to the gastrodiplomacy campaigns already in existence. So essentially what I'm talking about here is putting gastrodiplomacy in a bottle. And we're trying to see how this kind of processes here sort of evolved. One thing that I'd like to note here is that a lot of the sort of Japanese campaigns have become very much organized and focused on.
Hold the microphone further away and you'll notice less noise.
Okay. Is that good for everybody? Fantastic. I feel better too. Okay. So like I said, the Drink in a New Language campaign, it very much sort of represents that. I mean, you can very much see just specifically that they're using all English sort of text to communicate, in this case, specifically to audiences in the Western United States about 3 years ago in 2020. And so this campaign seems to be sort of one of many that's coming out of Japan right now, but it does sort of symbolize how this has become much more sort of targeted. If you looked at the people who were interviewed for this, they were often Americans working for Japanese agencies in the United States. And so this is sort of a kind of, in my opinion, kind of where this is all going and where this has sort of become most effective. As you can see down here, sort of a similar formula for the banner in a way, but obviously it's all in Korean, right? And that kind of, I think, symbolizes where the Korean program is at this time, where it is still very much focused on a domestic market and doesn't necessarily really live up to this idea of like sort of the Sool campaign that seemed to be coming up a few years ago. So something to keep in mind as we move forward. When we talk about sort of the Japanese sort of circumstances, one of the things that caught my mind was Sheila A. Smith had a very interesting interview where she specifically noted that sake was kind of on the menu, if you will, for the Japanese government as agricultural products that would be able to help development in rural areas, but also, be exports that can go out into the world that can sort of offset some of the imports that would come in from, I believe that was the European-Japan economic partnership. Not really big on calling things free trade agreements, but it gives you sort of a sense of where this kind of starts under the Abe administration. But a lot of this starts to kind of bubble up with the subcommittee for sake, right? As you can see here, there's a lot of, the resolution's kind of poor, but These are basically profiles of small sake distilleries out in the countryside that normally wouldn't be able to, compete at a global level. But they were given access to sort of a government sort of portfolio where, for example, they would highlight places they've been sold, for example, abroad. And you also get some idea of some of the creators, but also some of their marketing campaigns. But I use this one specifically because they were talking about like cowboy sake from the countryside. Okay, that's kind of got a bit of a ring to it. And so you can see here that there's sort of been active efforts over the last little while to address these kind of issues. And likewise, when we move on to, for example, the organization that we bring with Jetro, Kotra would be its sort of natural kind of friend here in Korea. We can see here that a lot of it has to do with focusing on agricultural issues and goods and services produced by small and medium-sized enterprises. You guys are all pretty familiar with Korea, and SMEs are always a hot topic here, right? So you could see where we're kind of going and getting into this idea that this might be beneficial for a lot of smaller businesses in both countries. And so Jetro goes on to engage in, much like we saw earlier, very deliberate campaigns in faraway places. Well, Hong Kong not being so far away, but giving you sort of a sense of where they're going. And you can obviously see the participation of not only Jetro, but their parent organization, for lack of a better phrase. And so they do go through and itemize and sort of engage in a very sort of targeted, prepared sort of plan to market these things to the Hong Kong market. And throughout my years visiting Hong Kong, I've seen this being repeated regularly with seafood and other products. So it is sort of part of this overall gastrodiplomacy campaign, but we do see that there is sort of a conscientious effort to approach the wine and spirits fair, for example, in 2019. Furthermore, they sort of start burrowing down into this organization a bit further by creating J-Fudo. Nice ring to it anyways. But like we talked about with public diplomacy earlier, this idea of the B2C sort of promotions, getting businesses and consumers in other places engaged was sort of starts to be sort of more explicitly defined. Yeah. So likewise, they also become a bit more savvy about utilizing more publicly accessible services like Instagram. Okay? I thought this was a particularly sort of effective ad campaign. But you can see that starts gaining a bit of traction in other places and people start using that hashtag. To be fair, this was a few years ago, so I imagine they've been a little more successful recently. So likewise, if we look over at the Korean side of things, I'm going to emphasize for that rural affairs issue. They are sort of looking at improving or sort of increasing income for farmers. And so I think part of that involves, getting farmers involved in sort of the production of alcohol and things like, base grains and other things that can be used in these things. You can see this a lot actually in Korea now with craft beer companies that are being given kind of sort of tax incentives to move out into rural areas, drag some employment and other things out there. Magpie was really successful with this, I think, in Jeju. So you can see this kind of sort of evolving over the last few years, even through COVID. Oop. Sorry. Okay. So, and in 2017, they do update their sort of policies, and they really do sort of commit to this idea of a liquor industry and sort of engaging and trying to promote the consumption of traditional liquor. I very much associate this with the implementation of a lot of free trade agreements between the United States and Europe, for example. And you really do see, like I was joking about before, the selection of beer at the Pyeongchang becomes kind of ridiculous, right? It gets to the point where you have at one point there was like Egyptian beer and all sorts of random things in there. And so part of what they're sort of suggesting here, I know this is sort of a drawn out sort of statement, but part of what they're trying to achieve here is, I think, twofold. One, they're trying to sort of make sure that their exports are getting some degree of sort of exposure abroad, but also trying to increase awareness and understanding of these things here in Korea. And so the guys at MAFRA are pretty busy, and much like their counterparts in Japan, they form a subsidiary, which is AT. We'll talk about them a bit more later. But they also sort of become very much focused on going into these sort of enhancing value, improving competitiveness of the food industry, as well as sort of things like alcohol and agriculture products. These guys are over in Yangjae if you ever want to sort of have a chat. Much more convenient than their office in Naju, which is very far away. But these guys are the ones that sort of pick up the mantle of the sort of global handshake campaign that was started, I think, with Im Young-bak's like wife back in the day. So I think I bought this off of the Thai AT website, but it is very much sort of focused on food product industry and driving economic growth forward. And sort of as they're implying here, this is very much sort of focused on the agricultural aspect of things. But you also see that they are not afraid to start bringing in not only K-pop influences, but also alcohol products into what they're promoting abroad. This is also, I believe, from the Hong Kong or Thai website. There are other names down here. Frankly speaking, I don't remember who these people are anymore. But they do sort of kind of start seeing a little bit of participation primarily from a lotte here. Obviously you can see, I've never seen a soju bottle that's chomtoram written in English, right? That's kind of first for me. I also really enjoy our friend Pocket over here. Just a nice little guy for those really committed alcoholics that need a little bottle of soju in the back pocket, right? But as you can see, like along with sort of this general sort of K-drama, K-pop kind of Hallyu wave that's sort of developing, they are sort of picking up on this idea that this can kind of sell alcohol as well. In 2019, I think you start to see much more concerted effort to develop a Korean Sool competition. I also can't remember who she is anymore, but she was sort of the MC for the event here. So there's also another sort of kind of K-pop connection that they're trying to draw upon. When I attended this many years ago, well, 5 years ago, it was sort of interesting because I was basically the only foreigner there. And so they were kind of confused because they're like, what are you doing here? And they gave me this form and I had to sign in essentially. And so that was kind of one of the first sort of tipping points for me to realize that, oh, maybe this has a lot more to do with maybe even protecting or promoting Korean products within Korea than so much sort of promoting it abroad. Finally, we have the KFPI, which sort of engages, like I was saying before, this kind of culinary diplomacy that was mentioned earlier. And they sort of focus on Korean food promotion. But as we can see too, right, there's also this sort of growing awareness that, you know, people want to learn how to make makgeolli. I know you guys have had a few lectures about this in the past, but after the sort of 2008, I think, explosion of makgeolli in Japan, that kind of petered out a bit. And then I think makgeolli kind of loses traction in the sort of imaginations of outsiders. So this is something interesting. And so we see sort of, you know, some attempts here to kind of develop a sort of, as the lecture was sort of stating, a sort of Sool diplomacy. Okay. What happened here? Sorry. For every plate to every glass, this is sort of the idea that we're moving away from not only having sort of alcohol as kind of a ancillary thing to food, but you're seeing that, like I mentioned at the beginning, the Japanese government starts taking alcohol very seriously as its own sort of product and starts developing pamphlets and campaigns to try and push this in other marketplaces, particularly London, Hong Kong, and the United States. So you can see that they're sort of talking about over here the various kind of local ingredients one might use in craft beer in a Japanese context. And so this starts to sort of show like there's much more of a sort of focused effort on having this kind of sort of sake related sort of Sool diplomacy that I was talking about in the title. And so, like I said, like this is all through the West Coast. I think they go all the way from Oregon down to California, and it's very much sort of kind of hipstery, contemporary vibes for the young folk, right? And so, what about global handshake and the idea of maybe global Sool, right? Part of the reason I included this scene, a number of Korean people kind of mentioned that this really kicked off this sort of Chimek kind of revolution that we had I guess it'd be pre-COVID. And another thing about this that kind of caught my eye was the idea that I've had a number of foreign students here in Korea and, people from abroad who've watched K-dramas to a certain degree sort of look at me and be like, are like Korean women like sort of alcoholics? Do they drink too much? And I sort of thought about that, and that sort of kind of cycled through a little bit. And it was like, okay, yeah, there is sort of a lot of depictions of alcohol in the media and with K-pop stars, for example, that especially for other Asian audiences might not be as familiar, for example. And so that's where this idea of like this global Sool sort of concept might be possible, I think, going further. We also saw this kind of pop up around the same time. We can all debate as foreigners here how successful the Gordon Ramsay cast collaboration was, but it did sort of highlight this idea. There was sort of an attempt to try and get alcohol products out there in a much more meaningful fashion. So primarily what I was going to say here, I think when I interviewed the heads of J-Fudo in Tokyo and what was it, the food service industry division of MAFRA down in, what was it, the administrative city there, I think they could both agree that it would be effective for them to have sake and Sool as more of a pairing to the food product promotion, things that go on with the Global Handshake campaign, and other things like JRO, which promoted Japanese restaurants sort of beginning in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so I think that there is sort of effectively a room for this to go from every plate to every glass in many ways. Something that people may or may not agree with, we can find bottles of soju in most alcohol vendors, for example, in Canada. Whether you're going to spend $10 on a bottle of chum charam in Canada, I'm not so sure. But I think there is sort of room for that to grow and room for awareness, access, and appreciation of these things to be, greater than it already is. Are people still boozing? Here's an interesting question. One thing that we might want to consider as well going forward is this is sort of projections from Bloomberg a few years ago, but like the idea in a lot of places, like alcohol consumption is somewhat in decline. If you look particularly in North America, right, obviously the availability of marijuana-based products, edibles, and other things does sort of eat into that kind of party time pie, right? And so in this case, I think we do need to kind of consider, how much room there is for that. Markets that are growing in the alcohol sort of realm, Indonesia, China, okay. Some of these places have their own very sort of developed kind of sense of what to drink, right? China very much places an emphasis on baijiu and Muay Thai. I can't remember if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so we do need to wonder sort of who are we targeting with these things as well. Like I said, the Japanese have been quite effective at targeting very specific markets like Hong Kong, London, and the American West Coast. And so I think that might be sort of an example that can be used to sort of broaden the scope and promoting the idea of, Sool, right? The Japanese do sort of benefit from this idea that if you talk to most people around the world, there is an understanding of what sake means, even if it is sort of a misconstrued version of what you're talking about. And so if I say Sool to people around the world, I'm not sure I'm going to get the same kind of grasp or response. And so I think there is room for work to be done. And, in some cases, we do have to be mindful that, some places are not going to be very interested. I mean, obviously, the Middle East is not exactly a target market for promoting, alcohol sales, right? So something to consider as well. But that's more or less where I'm going with this. I think the main thing that you can take away as a private sort of maybe distiller or vintner here in Korea is that the government does have programs that are sort of developing and maturing that you can take advantage of. That would sort of also potentially help agricultural regions in Korea that are increasingly depopulated and losing out on the economic activity in the cities. And likewise, if you're the government, you can probably take some solace in the idea that, these things may have an impact and they should be sort of maybe greater development in promoting these products abroad. Okay, I think that's. Oh, yes. Before we go into question and answer period, you'll be happy to know that the Korean Seoul Grand Festival this year is happening this weekend. So hooray, the 24th to the 26th, I believe. Oh, sorry, AT Plaza, yeah, Costco, if you will. Maybe we can adopt that. Once again, this kind of made me chuckle from my first experience there. English is available, but basic communication possible. So, like I said, if the Sool campaign really wants to get off the ground to, reach greater audiences, they might want to focus a little bit more on their promotional activities in different languages. But yeah, nice and convenient sort of end to our story here. Sorry, I haven't presented this in a while, so pardon the wobbly procedure, but I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I welcome your questions or comments. And yeah, thanks for your time. Okay.
How do you feel about Tim Hortons coming here? I'm sorry about louder, please.
It's in Gangnam?
Yeah.
And didn't they take over like that big, oh, sorry.
I asked how he feels about Tim Hortons coming to Korea. Very important nationalistic Canadian brand.
Yeah, I'm surprised I didn't make that correlation in the presentation. Anyways, if they got something other than donuts, I'll probably be interested, if I'm being honest. As I get older, I find my sort of, my joy that comes from eating donuts is really plummeted. So be curious to see what their offerings are, particularly because they've gone through a rebranding arc over the last couple of years. And they do seem to be, much like the agencies we've talked about here, exploring outside markets and looking to expand in other locations. So it'd be interesting to see how a sort of quintessentially Canadian fast food chain does, for example, here in Korea, outside of maybe, obviously foreigners, but a lot of people that have either lived, studied, or worked in Canada for that matter. Anything else? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
Well, when I was working for my company back in the States, a long time ago, Native Americans said to Korea, you must be an alcoholic because, what's the definition of alcoholic? I used to say that.
The last definition I saw was that if you have more than 7 drinks a week, you're an alcoholic. Yeah, that medical definition. Yeah. That means like once a day. So
they say 2 or 3 times per week you are already alcoholic.
right, or once depending on your consumption. But yeah, it's this is sort of kind of what I was getting at a little at the end of the presentation. You are seeing kind of attitudes towards alcohol, I'd say, adjusting, to say the least. Seltzer is a good example of this, right? Lower calories, right? Much more manageable. We're seeing even craft beer moving into non-alcoholic atmosphere, where, I mean, at that point, what's the point? At least in my humble opinion. But yeah, this was something that was pointed out to me in other countries. Like people are like, I watch K-dramas. Those girls seem to drink a lot. And I was like, That's a good point. And so like it does sort of kind of did make me sort of think about that. And not to say it's just the women here, but or anybody in particular, but it did sort of kind of get me kind of thinking in that direction about a couple of things. You got me. Not exactly a big fan.
It's a lot.
So they're all getting blasted basically, right? Yeah. And so I think like, I was saying this does seem a little odd, especially for, other regional countries, maybe outside of Japan or China, for example, where, a lot of places in Southeast Asia, like drinking is considered somewhat faux pas due to religious concerns. So this did seem kind of like an interesting observation coming from, obviously I'm very Anglo-Saxon sort of Scotch and beer kind of guy. So that was something I thought was important to kind of highlight, particularly if you are sort of engaged in this K-pop related kind of Hallyu Wave adjacent program of promoting alcohol products abroad. Sorry, oh, up here.
Quite interesting subject, Sool diplomacy. As a person who studied Sool diplomacy at the school.
Okay, sure.
What do you think of Korean rice wine, makgeolli, and also beer compared to other countries' products? And also, the public diplomacy, it was considered cultural diplomacy. Public diplomacy covers a lot of things. We mentioned three things: national branding, public diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy and culinary diplomacy. And when you're talking about when you're talking about public diplomacy, we are talking about giving lectures about Korean public policies, etc., that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think like for my research, I did have to sort of narrow it down and be kind of clear how I defined what I thought gastrodiplomacy was in this case, in relation to sort of the few academics that have actually touched on that as a term and tried to explain it. And so, yeah, that's why I sort of refer to it as more creating awareness, access, and appreciation, as opposed to trying to get into this kind of very broad subject matter. And likewise, yeah, public diplomacy has been around much longer and obviously has had much more time to grow and expand into all sorts of avenues that could be discussed. And so I think that's worthy. At some point, you do need to kind of pick your lane and make your statements and claims, at least when it comes to academic papers, right? And sorry, what was the first? Makgeolli, right? Okay. So, oh, sure. Well, this kind of sound bad, but I'm a big Jeju makgeolli guy. So I know it comes in a bottle, it's plastic, and it's not super traditional, but that's where I have my best beach makgeolli memories. So maybe it's just simple that way. Part of the reason I didn't really touch on makgeolli in the 2008 sort of revolution there is that makgeolli is very much fundamentally hindered by its ability to be transported abroad. And even when I find makgeolli in places like Hawaii or Canada or whatever, it is very not good, I guess you could say. It is, it's, very sort of like that sort of aspartame flavor, and a lot of the preservatives really come out. And so I think there does need to be some thought as to how to focus more on more packageable products that can be sent abroad and can, for example, in Hong Kong, you need to be able to sit on a shelf for 6 months before they'll even let you ship it. So if your makgeolli only lasts like 2 weeks or maybe 3-4 weeks, they won't even let you send it to the country, right? So, well, the SAR to be specific. So that does make it kind of tricky. With beer, I think there's something really interesting happening. I think you're seeing this very slow harmonization of beer flavors. We were talking about Kelly earlier. Yeah, I still can't really taste anything when I have it. I think that's on purpose. But like other things like Cloud and Terra, you can sort of see there's this kind of slow change. And I think that's not only to accommodate like changing tastes here in Korea, but that might also be effective in, being a marketable product abroad if that becomes sort of more of a tipping point, I think. So, yeah, but OB forever. There you go. Okay, sorry, I think the gentleman in the back. Yeah, sorry.
So you just curious, the fact that they kind of focus on the fact it's from Denmark and Terra now they're kind of Tasmania, it changed in from Australia.
a rumor they got sued. Yeah, like
That abroad, like in Korea, it seems to work, but I think, particularly with the Denmark thing, you know how popular it is. I'm actually kind of running bar, actually, if there's Danish people who come, and they kind of say, like, oh,
no idea what's going on.
it's 4 times.
There's even a flag in the middle, right? Yeah.
Do you think that it's marketable or the right approach?
Yeah, so I think like obviously we're dealing with two different kind of drinking traditions, right? Like for a lot of, you know, Westerners, right, the idea of drinking sort of beer as a discrete thing by itself means that you're maybe emphasizing this flavor more, whereas often beer here is much more a sort of lubricant for other things, right? It's either moving soju around or helping you digest samgyeopsal, something like this, right? And so I think in that respect, we do have to remember that this is sort of a different sort of battlefield, if you will, for that kind of attempt. But it is kind of weird. Someone was saying to me the other day that like Tara got sued. I don't know if that's speculation or not, but
I did. I wrote about it in an article.
okay, there we go. Me
Uh,
too.
caught for false advertising, specifically about the use of the unique use that they have of Australian grains, when in fact all the big brew companies were getting their, I think, grain of malt or something from Australia. So they did a label redesign, and when they did the redesign, they made it look less Australian. Like they took out a lot of mentions. It's very clear they just rescinded a lot of weird claims at the same time.
Yeah, there was definitely like, I mean, their advertising campaign was really interesting because it was like this like wheat tornado, and what's his name got like swept up, and you know, it's like, I guess it is like supposed to be Australia, but it is sort of generic in its own little way. I don't know, to me, it kind of tastes like sort of Molson Canadian or something kind of very kind of basic lager. So I take it in stride, but I mean, I'm definitely not drinking Tsingtao anymore, right? So, you know, saw that video. So I've transitioned to different green bottles, if that's what you're asking. But yeah, I mean, it is kind of a weird thing, especially if you do get Danish customers. You're like, yeah, the consulate might find that information interesting. Who knows, right? So yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think if you're running a bar, you do need to have that sort of base lager that, you know, is from here and is like $5 or cheaper, right? Well, there you go. I had no idea what it was until you asked me about it. And I mean, that was like my first girlfriend in university. So yeah. Sorry, over here, yeah.
Question, have you seen any promotion of Somac internationally? Everyone in Korea is learn to me.
Yeah, and you know, people get quite creative with it, right? They got, you know, these intricate bomb shots and stuff like that that are all a lot of fun, right? One thing that I came across when I was doing my research was NPR, and this was an interview that was done with a maybe a Jinro rep in California following sort of the whole Gangnam Style thing. And this, I mean, you know, I finally went back and found it, but what they did is they did take like the soju out and like basically started walking down the boardwalk in California and being like, you want to give this a whip and see what people were going to think about it. And it didn't really get any traction. Like the people they were interviewing were like, yeah, okay. Like it didn't seem to, I don't know, really capture the imagination. So I'm not sure if the whole bomb shot thing would move forward. I mean, like I said, you can buy soju in most liquor stores across North America. I think it's just a question of like, you're really penetrating layers and layers of not only habit, but advertising and, you know, massive multinationals that their whole job is basically to sell billions of dollars worth of alcohol. So that might be just sort of a tricky aspect to it. And maybe, yeah, getting past that soju ball is, you know, pretty tricky, I think, at this point, just from my personal opinion. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I know from every foreigner who gets introduced here, they very quickly learn how to drink ball.
Yeah, so I mean, like I went home and I went to the Calgary Stampede, right? Big outdoor Western festival, and I went to a friend's house and brought a giant bottle of soju. got everybody going, but I don't know if they remember, to be honest. So, yeah, I don't know if my vague, limited attempts at sort of making Sool happen was particularly effective, but yeah. Sorry, ma'am, up there.
Well, Nigeria is one of the biggest market in Scotch. Korea is one of the biggest market. We drink a lot, relatively. And so I just wonder, do we Koreans drink a lot compared to the other people? And what do you think the reason is?
Yeah, I think
Per capita consumption of alcohol in the world.
yeah, like volume, right? Yeah. I I went into a bar I used to work at in my hometown, and my manager was like, "Hey," and he grabbed the Guinness Book of World Records and he whipped it open, and he was like, "It's like, yeah, Korea is the largest consumer of alcohol by volume on the planet. It's mostly."
You have to went by degree. Look at the vodka. The Russian friends, they say, oh, so there's nothing, almost nothing. Then there's a 50 degree more than, right? From Mount to the China,
Yeah, that's usually up by 30–40%. Yeah.
That is so much. Yeah, of course, they drink like stop drinking beer.
I don't.
Unfair. That's true.
I mean, you can take it up with the Guinness Book of World Records, but yeah, it was based on volume, and so
What's the professional terminology?
this was a few years ago, so I don't remember exactly what it said, but I think it was literally volume, like liters per year. So, like, for example, I think the Czechs are still the kings of beer. They still drink the most beer in the world, but you guys, when it comes down to soju, that's like the largest consumed alcohol, I think, per capita in Korea or something like this.
I found people one Russian, a couple of Russian guys to a restaurant. They say, they just drink with a big glass. They just pop down fast.
Yeah. I ran into some Russians in Busan. They were on a birthday party, and it was something else. Yeah. They do live up to their reputation, anyways.
Anyway, after consumption by one fair.
Yeah, I mean, I would think.
As in 2016, most recent.
Yeah.
Korea is well down there. Korea's number 38 at about.
Adjusted for alcohol.
It's
I'm glad.
pure alcohol per liter, so like.
Okay, there we go.
Not
Yeah.
like- So expanding the amount of alcohol in different drinks and comparing it. And at that point, Korea's number 38 about 10 liters per person, 10 liters or so.
Yeah.
Whereas
I think this
the number one is Estonia.
So yeah, like I think this fact is probably from 2012 when this comes out. So, but yeah, that was a sort of Guinness Book of World Records sort of thing back in the day. So.
That statistic and I respect it.
There are many ways to think. I'd be curious about price-wise. Who spends the most on alcohol in the world per capita?
Sure. Sorry, I don't think we answered your question.
If we're going back.
Did we answer your question or not? I don't know. We sort of bounced around a bit. A lot of people said to me, especially people who worked at Korean beer companies, like corporate even, were saying like, oh, it's our national right. Like there was a sort of this mantra that like there's an entitlement to it. And a lot of people like assume that's why it's so cheap. That everybody, regardless of your sort of economic level, should be able to get kind of, a little loose after work or whatever. And so, cigarettes, other sort of sin tax related products seem to be sort of given kind of a bit of a pass. And I'm not sure if that's coming from like the developmental model, out of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, or maybe a different sort of cultural aspect. But it does seem to me that there is kind of a consensus that you should be allowed to get, like I said, a little loose after work and not be sort of financially hard done by. I mean, a bottle of soju is like $1 US right now. It's insane. Sorry, anybody else with questions or comments? Want rock, scissors, paper? All right, there we go.
Thanks for your presentation. First, very short question. Soul Festival is free of charge?
Yeah, there's a registration website there. There you go. That's 2 bottles of soju right there. You're well on your way. Right?
Studies to rewrite the thesis.
Yeah, that was the sort of subtext of this, basically. Yeah, so
And,
should be publicly available.
Campaigns or the efforts by either the Japanese government or the Korean government agencies involved, has it been, in your evaluation, fully successful, moderately successful? Still, some work to go?
One of the problems I think is that like COVID comes in as this stuff is starting to mature, right? 2019 is when we start to see the Japanese really kind of target foreign places, specifically with like, London, it was like oysters and sake, right? They had these very kind of targeted events. And then, yeah, like those things get shut down, right? You can't have like a little beer tasting festival in Oregon during COVID regulations and stuff like that. And so I think that sort of stunts the growth of these projects. Insofar as Korea goes, like I said, like we look here, I think it's still very much trying to, never mind. Still very much trying to kind of build up domestic interests in a way. It does seem to be much more sort of friendly. Like if you do go to the Soul Festival, you will find it is sort of, heavily Korean, I guess you could say. So not so much like what it was in 2019, I think, when they started, but I still think that like that sort of international campaign really hasn't kicked off in earnest. And so that could be room for opportunity going forward, I think. And so that's part of the recommendations for sort of government at that level.
I think both countries face serious challenges fostering economic growth in countryside areas. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I haven't looked at it specifically, but if you look at Japan, right, same thing. You have craft breweries that are very much sort of rural, but also I think you're seeing a lot more whiskey distilleries appearing kind of in the periphery, not so much in the core. And so I think the general idea is that if you can get some employment and interest, tours and other things going out there, that can lead to some revitalization in the countryside. And then also, if you're using sort of authentic ingredients, and all the hipsters out there will love it, and that comes from sort of maybe nearby farms, then maybe you have something going there. Is it happening? Did Playground go under the other day? Playground Brewery? Yeah, are they still in operation? I thought I saw that they were closed, and I thought, like, oh, that's not a good sign for that kind of rural model of development, right? If they can't kind of maintain sort of interest, if it's 45 minutes outside the city, for example. Yeah, but I did see sort of similar sort of signs of things happening when I did talk to people about the craft brewery scene, for example, in Japan. And so, yeah, is it working? We probably have to go take a look at sort of more government statistics, which means going to Naju, maybe, which should be sort of a business trip for another time.
Maybe providing transportation for the consumers of alcohol to the countryside will be something to try.
Does Cass still do that? The Cass breweries, can you still get a Cass bus out to the, anybody know? I heard you used to be able to get like a bus that would take you to the Cass brewery outside of Seoul, and you could go have a good time. But okay, there you go. Right. So would that be at all sponsored? Like, there's got to be some local development agency involved in that,
It looks very good.
Yeah, that's by program.
Okay, so yeah, local district maybe. Yeah, okay. Up to you. Sorry, last one over there.
You felt that you weren't sure any Canadians would buy $10 soju. Is that the actual price? What are the price like? For the more like 15.
Yeah.
But I think that's
So yeah, I remember like getting a deal at a restaurant. It was on special for $9.99. I was like, ooh, like.
It's from West US, but they're not it's been there for quite a while, not as a sale to consumers, but sales to restaurants, because commercial soda is very carefully meant to be under 20% alcohol, which means that they can use it in cocktails without needing a hard liquor license.
Ooh,
That was extremely
sneaky.
common in in LA, even back in the 90s, early 2000s, started with K-Town and Japanese restaurants looking for ways to serve low alcohol.
So yeah, I guess at that point you're getting into the intricacies of interstate commerce in the United States and its requisite sort of alcohol rules.
Data. First of all, some old data. When after my first year in Korea, I went back to my hometown, went to a Korean restaurant. I saw the menu. They have Baekseju and soju. Let's order 1 bottle of each so everybody can try. And the waitress was like, "That'll be $20 each." I was there in the summer, and I went to a bar that was serving soju, but they were mixing soju cocktails. So you wouldn't buy a bottle of it; you'd buy a cocktail with soju in it. And I think we might see more of that in North America.
Yeah, I've heard like getting traction in places like the Philippines and stuff as well, where that's like kind of like in Singapore, because it's, Singapore is quite an expensive place. And so people are like, well, if you get a big soju cocktail, it's actually kind of cheap.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's that value proposition there again. And yeah, so I think one of the big questions you can probably think about is like, how do you get past just shipping soju abroad? I think the last figure I saw was something like $147 million worth of soju was sold in the United States. Kind of sounds like a lot of money, but in a market of pushing, US is probably almost 340 million people now. That's not a lot, right? And so there's got to be, some other angles that can be tried to kind of make that more of a thing. And yeah, I don't know, BTS is kind of out in the boondocks, start doing the military service. So you might have to find some other reservoirs of cultural products to export, right? Anybody else sort of questions? We're good. All right. Oh, last one in back.
That Americans going to Korean restaurants. It's like doing chimen, and you go, oh, this is a Korean thing, I know, you're a chicken. Oh, I'm gonna have so much with my bulgogi. They're not trying to market this as a thing that everybody does. They're trying to market it really specifically. It's understood very specifically as a Korean activity that people can engage in.
So I guess the one thing I'll say about that is that, the Korean government did a lot of work with restaurants and restaurateurs being like, come to LA, we're going to show you what the menu is going to be like and how to treat customers and all this sort of thing, right? You can see remnants of this around this neighborhood, like the best restaurant with like the sort of Korean government emblem on it, right? But they didn't do that with alcohol, salesmen or, liquor store owners and stuff like that. And so, for example, the liquor store near my parents' house, clearly a bunch of Korean guys outside, and they wouldn't say a word to you. They just stare at you, smoking their mild sevens. And we go in and buy our alcohol and leave. And so there was really no sort of marketing pitch or angle where they were trying to get they weren't sort of trying to get you involved in the game, I guess would be my point. And so, the attaché that runs the piano job near my apartment, same way. He only talked to me one time. That's because I had a hockey stick in my hand and he was sort of weirdly excited about that. So yeah, there might have to be some reversion back to these previous strategies that were tried in the early 2000s to get people sort of more aware and more professionalized when coming to Korean cuisine. Could be applied again to, for example, Sool sales. Okay.